17 years. That's how long it had been since my father slammed the door in my face and told me I wasn't his daughter anymore. 17 years of silence, absence, and a wall built out of words never spoken. And then, there he was sitting 2 rows ahead of me at my brother's wedding shoulders, squared like he still owned the room. I hadn't planned on speaking to him. I hadn't planned on anything, really. Just show up. Support my younger brother raise a glass and leave quietly before old ghosts caught up with me. But ghosts don't wait for permission. He turned just slightly enough for his voice to carry back toward me. His lips curled, eyes glinting with the same cold steel I remembered from childhood. If it wasn't for pity, he sneered, no one would have invited you. 5 words. They cut deeper than I wanted to admit even after all these years. I could feel heads turning, whispers fluttering like moths through the reception hall. But me, I lifted my glass of red wine, took a slow sip, and smiled. Because I already knew what was coming. The bride, my brother's new wife, walked to the center of the dance floor, microphone in hand. Her cheeks flushed with the glow of love and champagne, she paused, glancing toward me with a look that almost seemed rehearsed. And then she spoke, her voice, firm, clear, echoing over the clink of glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor tonight, before we continue, to recognize someone who has given more to this country than most of us can imagine. Please rise and join me in welcoming Major General Davis. The room stilled. Then chairs scraped, feet shuffled, and one by one the guests stood. Applause thundered through the hall. My brother froze wide-eyed, my father's face drained of color. That was the moment, the one I had carried like a hidden medal, waiting not for revenge, but for recognition. You probably want to know how I got here, how the girl who once ironed her father's uniforms became the woman introduced as Major General Davis at the wedding, where she wasn't supposed to matter. So let me take you back. I grew up in a house where discipline wasn't just encouraged, it was law. My father retired. Sergeant Major Robert Davis was a man carved out of stone and steel. He believed in rank, order, and respect, though respect in his dictionary only ever flowed one way. To him, sons were the legacy bearers. Daughters. Daughters were supposed to stand quiet at the edges, polite, unseen. I was 10 the first time he told me I'd never wear the uniform. We were watching a parade on base soldiers, marching crisp and proud brass gleaming in the sunlight. I said, "Dad, I want to do that one day." He didn't even look down, just muttered, "Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." I remember my throat tightening, but I didn't cry. I never did. I learned early that tears weren't currency in our house. They didn't buy comfort. They only bought lectures. Still, I didn't stop dreaming. I studied his manuals when he wasn't looking, memorized rank insignia, learned to shine boots until I could see my face in them. He never noticed, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. By the time I was 17, I knew I'd apply to West Point. I'd already mailed the forms. The night I told him, he didn't raise his voice. He just stood there staring like I'd spoken blasphemy. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and said, "You want to be a soldier? Fine. Start by surviving without me. Get out." My mother begged him to reconsider, but her voice was always soft next to his thunder. I packed one duffel bag and left that night, the smell of his cigars still clinging to my clothes. I didn't see him again for nearly 2 decades until that wedding night. But don't mistake my story for tragedy. What he intended as exile became fuel. Every mile I ran, every blister I bled through, every time an instructor said, "You don't belong here," I thought of his words, "Get out." And I answered silently, "Watch me stay." Those first years nearly broke me. No family to call, no letters from home. My brother wrote once a short note, "Dad says you'll come back when you fail. I hope you don't." I kept it folded in my locker like a talisman, proof someone somewhere believed. The academy wasn't kind. My male classmates tested me, mocked me, waited for me to falter. But I didn't. I rose. One pull-up at a time, one marksmanship score at a time, one field exercise at a time. I earned what no one wanted to give. And when the time came to pin my first bars, I stood a little taller, not because he was watching, but because I knew he wasn't. That absence became my fire. So as I stood in that wedding hall, wine glass in hand, listening to strangers applaud my name, I didn't see revenge. I saw the culmination of every sleepless night, every scar, every soldier who'd once whispered, "Thanks, ma'am, you saved me." My father sneered at me, but the bride, his new daughter-in-law, spoke the words he'd never said, Major General Davis. And that, I promise you, was only the beginning. Discipline wasn't something my father taught. It was something he imposed. Our home felt less like a house and more like an outpost. Shoes lined by the door at a perfect 45-degree angle. Dinner at exactly 1800 hours, no exceptions. Chores completed before bed, inspected as though he were reviewing a barracks. To outsiders, it might have looked like structure. To me, it felt like inspection under constant floodlights. He wasn't a bad man, not in the way people think of bad men. He didn't raise his hand against us, and he never drank beyond a single glass of bourbon at night. But he carried himself like every moment was still a deployment, and his family, his wife, his son, and me were soldiers under his command. My mother tried to soften the edges. She was a teacher, a woman with chalk-stained fingers, and a bookshelf filled with poetry. She read to me at night when my father was on duty. She'd sit at the edge of my bed whispering Emily Dickinson like scripture. Hope is the thing with feathers. She'd say her voice a lullaby that carried me past the rigid silence of the rest of the house. But the moment the front door opened and my father stepped in, hope folded its wings. He reserved his pride for my younger brother Matthew. Every little league game, every spelling bee ribbon, Dad clapped Matthew on the back as if he were already wearing the uniform, already a man ready to carry the family flag forward. Me, I was the quiet shadow. The daughter who ironed his dress greens on Sunday nights, careful not to let a crease go crooked. The one who lined his boots, polished his brass, and listened at the doorway while he told Matthew stories about battlefields and bravery. When I was 10, he took us to the Army-Navy game. The stadium roared flags, waving cadets marching in formation, their uniforms sharp enough to cut glass. My eyes widened. I couldn't look away. "Dad?" I whispered, tugging his sleeve. "I want to do that one day." He didn't even glance at me, just smirked and said, "You'll never wear those colors, kid. Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." The words lodged in my chest like shrapnel. My mother saw the way my face fell. She squeezed my hand, but she didn't contradict him. Not then. She knew battles with him were wars you rarely won. So I kept my dreams quiet. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just watched. I studied his medals in their glass case, memorized the names of battles etched on the brass plates. I traced the outline of his Purple Heart when he wasn't looking. And when I was old enough, I started keeping my own private rituals. Push-ups behind my locked bedroom door, running laps around the block after school until my lungs burned, studying strategy manuals I borrowed from the library under the pretense of school projects. If my father's approval was a fortress I'd never breach, then I'd build my own. Brick by brick, rep by rep, grade by grade. The first real fracture came when I turned 16. I'd won an award in a leadership program at school, and my mother beamed as I placed the certificate on the dinner table. My father didn't look up from his peas. "That's nice," he said flatly, "but leadership isn't learned in classrooms, and it's not for girls." I wanted to throw the certificate in his face. Instead, I nodded, cleared the dishes, and scrubbed them until my hands were raw. That night, I made a silent vow I would never let his dismissal be the last word on who I was. 2 years later, my acceptance letter arrived. West Point. Thick envelope, heavy paper, the kind that carried more than words, it carried destiny. I remember standing in the living room letter, trembling in my hands, heart pounding. "Dad," I said softly, holding it out like an offering. I got in. He stared at the seal, the black and gold crest of the United States Military Academy. For 30 seconds, he said nothing. Then his jaw tightened. "So you're serious about this nonsense?" "I am," I whispered. His response wasn't anger, it was worse. He dropped a manila folder on the coffee table. Inside were applications to nursing schools, teaching programs, law schools. Every one of them carefully filled out with my name already printed on top. Not one bore the insignia of West Point. "Pick one," he said coldly. "Do something useful. Don't disgrace the family." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Matthew shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, caught between loyalty to our father and love for me. I folded the letter back into its envelope and held it to my chest. "I'm going," I said finally. That was the night the fault line cracked wide open. 17 years later, I would sip my wine at my brother's wedding and remember that night vividly, the moment he stopped seeing me as a daughter and started seeing me as a threat to his legacy. He thought he could erase me with silence. What he didn't know was that silence in the right hands can be the sharpest blade of all. The night I left home, the air smelled of tobacco smoke and old leather, the scent of my father's chair, the throne he ruled our house from. I stood in the doorway with a single duffel bag slung over my shoulder. Inside, a few changes of clothes, a pair of running shoes, and the West Point acceptance letter folded neatly in the side pocket like a secret weapon. My mother clutched the banister, eyes red. "Please, Robert," she whispered, "don't do this." But my father didn't soften. He stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed over his chest, face carved from granite. "You want to play soldier." His voice was calm, too calm. "Then start now. Out." Those were the last words he said to me for 17 years. Matthew hovered behind him, torn between us. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but my father's glare silenced him. I met my brother's eyes, for one fleeting second eyes, filled with something like apology, something like helplessness. And then I stepped into the night. The door slammed behind me, cutting me off from the only family I'd ever known. The first weeks were brutal. I slept on a friend's couch, worked double shifts at a diner to afford textbooks. When the academy's physical prep list arrived, 5-mile runs, pull-ups, obstacle courses, I trained in the dark before dawn, sweat freezing on my skin muscles, screaming. I could almost hear my father's voice in the back of my mind. "You'll never make it." Every push-up was an answer. Every mile was defiance. When I arrived at West Point, I expected challenge. What I didn't expect was the loneliness. Parents crowded the campus, hugging sons and daughters, snapping photos. My spot on the bleachers sat empty. I told myself it didn't matter. But that night, alone in my bunk, I unfolded my acceptance letter again, just to remind myself it was real, that I belonged, whether anyone else believed it or not. The academy was fire, and I was forged in it. Cadet life was grueling: early morning drills, endless inspections, instructors barking until their voices broke. Some classmates cracked under the pressure. Others thrived. Me, I endured. The men in my class tested me daily. "Hey, Davis," one sneered during a field exercise, "why don't you go back to ironing uniforms? Leave the real work to us." I looked him dead in the eye, mud streaked across my face, sweat dripping into my collar. "I'll race you to the finish," I said. And I did, beating him by 10 minutes, hauling not just my rucksack, but a wounded teammates as well. They stopped underestimating me after that, at least not out loud. Letters from home never came. My mailbox stayed empty, while others filled theirs with postcards, care packages, envelopes scented faintly of perfume or aftershave. Until one day, a thin envelope appeared. My heart jumped when I saw my last name on the front. Hands shaking, I tore it open. It wasn't from my father. It was from Matthew. "Dad says you'll come back when you fail. I hope you don't." 7 words that kept me alive through more nights than I could count. My mother tried in her own way. She called the academy once, but I missed the call during drill. The message she left was short, rushed, her voice soft, like always. "Stay strong, sweetheart. Storms don't last forever." That was the last time I heard from her for years. By the time I graduated, I was no longer the girl who ironed my father's uniforms. I was Second Lieutenant Davis, standing at attention in a pressed dress uniform of my own. Rows of cadets flanked me, sabers gleaming overhead as the march began. I searched the crowd out of habit. Rows of proud parents applauded, whistled, waved flags. My gaze snagged on an empty space where my family should have been. The ache was sharp, but it didn't crush me. I straightened my spine, saluted, and marched forward. Because in that moment, I understood something vital. Family didn't have to be blood. Family could be forged in mud, sweat, and fire. Still, the silence followed me into the army. First posting, Fort Bragg. Long days filled with logistics, drills, paperwork that never seemed to end. Nights were lonelier. No one waiting at home, no letters tucked under my door. But I had a purpose. And purpose was enough. Until deployment came, and purpose suddenly had teeth. I can still remember my first time stepping off a C-130 into desert heat that slapped like a furnace door. Dust filled my lungs, grit crunched in my teeth. Soldiers beside me looked twice my size, their faces hidden behind sunglasses and determination. One of them muttered, "What's she doing here?" I pretended not to hear, but I did. I always did. It didn't matter. I wasn't there to prove them wrong. I was there to prove myself right. That's when I realized exile wasn't a punishment. It was preparation. Years later, at my brother's wedding, when my father sneered, "If it wasn't for pity, no one would have invited you," I didn't flinch. Because I'd already lived 17 years without his approval. And I'd learned something he never had. Silence can break you, or it can forge you into steel. I chose steel. My first deployment was supposed to be routine. At least that's what they told us on the plane. Transport duty escorting supply convoys through a contested zone in Afghanistan. Nothing glamorous, nothing heroic. Just keep the trucks moving and watch the roads for IEDs. But war has a way of laughing at plans. The desert heat was merciless. It pressed down like a hammer, turning body armor into an oven. Dust coated our throats, clung to our eyelashes, settled into every crease of fabric. My squad was restless, some humming quietly to keep nerves at bay, others silent with eyes scanning the horizon. We were halfway through the route when the first shot cracked, a sound so sharp it seemed to split the air in half. Then came the echoing rattle of gunfire from the ridges above. "Contact left," someone shouted. Chaos. Bullets chewed into the convoy, sparking off metal, shattering glass. I dove behind a rusting container weapon, raised heart pounding. Training kicked in. Short bursts of fire control your breathing, count your ammo. But then I heard it. A scream. Not the panicked kind, but the raw, tearing kind. One of ours was down. I sprinted toward the sound rounds, whizzing past close enough to feel the heat. A private lay in the dirt, his leg mangled, blood pooling fast, his face as white as the sand around him. "Stay with me," I barked, dropping to my knees. "You're not dying today." My hands moved before my brain caught up. Tourniquet high on the thigh, cinched tight until he bit down on his sleeve to keep from screaming. Pressure on the wound, one hand slick with blood, the other fumbling for the radio. "Medevac. This is Lieutenant Davis. We need immediate extraction coordinates." Gunfire roared again, closer this time. I pressed harder, my side burning from shrapnel I hadn't realized had torn through my vest. I could taste copper in the back of my throat, the smell of blood and gunpowder mingling into something I'll never forget. We dragged him 40 yards under fire, each step a miracle. When the helicopter finally swooped low, rotors chopping the air, I shoved the private onto the stretcher and climbed in after him, still keeping pressure on his leg. By the time we landed, I was soaked uniform, sticky with his blood. My own seeping through the bandages, another medic hastily wrapped around my ribs. They wanted me on a stretcher too. I refused. I walked off that bird under my own power. Not because I wasn't in pain, but because I knew the men were watching. That day, I earned a new nickname, Iceback. They said I bled ice, not blood. I didn't care about the name. I cared that the private lived. He wrote me a letter years later thanking me, told me he named his daughter Avery after me. That meant more than any medal ever could. But that day also changed me. Until then, I'd been chasing approval, proving I could belong in a world built by men like my father. After that firefight, I understood something different. Belonging wasn't given, it was taken, forged in fire, and sealed in blood. I called home after the mission, body aching stitches pulling at my side. I left a message on the family answering machine, voice hoarse. I made it back. I thought you should know. The call was never returned. Instead, silence answered. I sat alone in the barracks that night, the desert wind rattling the windows. I stared at the scars on my hands and realized if blood wouldn't claim me, then honor would. That was the first time I stopped reaching for him and started standing on my own. Combat changes you. Not in the way movies like to show with explosions and glory, but in the quiet, grinding way. The kind that slips into your bones and never quite leaves. After Afghanistan, I walked different thought, different, breathed different. I carried the weight of that private's blood on my hands, even though he lived. Every scar, every stitch reminded me that leadership isn't about medals or salutes, it's about what you're willing to shoulder when no one else can. Back stateside, I buried myself in work, logistics, training rotations, endless briefings under fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects. Some officers chased promotions with polished smiles and politics. Me, I chased competence, excellence, the kind of record no one could deny even if they wanted to. And they did want to. Make no mistake, being a woman in uniform was like walking a tightrope strung over a minefield. Too soft, and you were dismissed. Too tough, and you were branded. But I learned to balance. Quietly, carefully. And every time someone tried to push me off, I dug my heels in deeper. There was a moment, I remember it clear as yesterday. A corporal under my command froze during a live fire exercise. His hands shook so badly, he dropped his rifle. I pulled him aside, looked him straight in the eye. "You're not weak," I told him. "You're scared. That's different. And fear means you're paying attention. Now use it." He nodded, swallowed hard, and finished the drill. A year later, he wrote me a letter from deployment, "Ma'am. You're the only one who ever saw me." That line stayed with me, because it was true. I knew what it felt like to be invisible, to have your worth dismissed before you even had the chance to show it. I wasn't going to let that happen to anyone under my watch. My reputation grew not as the loudest voice in the room, but as the one people listened to when things went sideways. The officers above me noticed grudgingly at first. Commendations followed. New assignments. I rose from lieutenant to captain, then major, each rank a rung on a ladder. I hadn't just climbed, I'd built it with my own hands. Still, every milestone came with the same ritual. I'd call home. The phone would ring and ring until the machine picked up. My voice always sounded too small when I left messages. "Dad, it's me. I just pinned captain today." Or "I was promoted to major." No reply, not once. But word traveled. Through old army buddies, through family whispers, I heard what he said. That I was making the military soft. That I was just a symbol. That none of it was real. And yet when I looked into the eyes of the men and women under my command, I saw the truth reflected back. They followed me. Not because of my name, not because of tradition, but because I'd proven I'd bleed with them if I had to. By then, my brother Matthew had carved out his own path. Law school, a shiny firm in D.C., his photo in magazines about rising young attorneys. Dad bragged about him at every VFW hall in town. Me, I was still the exile, the daughter whose name wasn't spoken at the dinner table. But I didn't need his applause anymore. I had found a different kind of family, soldiers who would stand shoulder to shoulder with me in the mud, who'd carry my weight as I carried theirs. I thought often of my mother in those years, of the way she used to read poetry under the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Her voice came back to me sometimes in the quiet like an echo. Hope is the thing with feathers. It struck me then that hope had carried me farther than anger ever could. Hope and grit and the knowledge that no matter how silent my father stayed, I wasn't silent. Not anymore. By the time I earned the Silver Eagle of a colonel, I knew the truth legacy isn't inherited. It's earned one choice at a time, and my choices had built something stronger than blood. I had built myself. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning. I'd just finished a run, sweat still cooling on my skin, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was Matthew. His voice was flat, almost clinical. "Mom's in hospice. Breast cancer. She doesn't have long. The world narrowed to a pinprick. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and now he was telling me the one person who had ever been soft in our house was slipping away. I booked the first flight home. When I walked into the hospice room, the smell of antiseptic hit me first. Sharp, sterile, unforgiving. My mother lay small and pale, her hair gone, her skin paper thin. Tubes whispered beside her. My father stood in the corner, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. He didn't move when I entered. Her hand lifted weakly when she saw me. I rushed to her side, my uniform still wrinkled from travel. She smiled faintly, lips cracked but warm. "Keep flying," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, but it was enough to shatter me. She was gone before sunrise. At the funeral, I wore dress blues. My father didn't look at me, not once. He spoke about her kindness, her loyalty, her patience, but his eyes never touched mine. Afterward, I returned to base. I waited for a letter, a call, any sign from him. What came instead was an email, 3 sentences. "The funeral was nice. I hope the Army is treating you well. I still don't understand your decision." That was it. No love, no acknowledgement, just the same wall reinforced. I stared at those words until the screen blurred. Then I closed the laptop and went back to work. Because work was the only thing that didn't turn its back on me. The Army consumed me in those years. Deployment after deployment, assignment after assignment. I poured myself into every mission, every operation. If the family I was born into didn't want me, then the one I chose, the one in uniform, would get every ounce of me. But service has a cost. There were nights I lay in a tent with sand rattling against the canvas body, aching from shrapnel that still pinched nerves in my side. There were mornings I dragged myself out of bed despite pain that screamed louder than the alarm. I learned to hide it, to move through pain as if it were just another order. The promotions came. Lieutenant Colonel, Colonel. Each new rank should have felt like a victory. Instead, they felt like markers in a marathon I was running alone. I mailed him photos once, a picture of me in full dress uniform after being awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, a copy of the ceremony program. No reply. Later, I heard through one of his old Army buddies that he'd torn the picture in half after staring at it for a long time. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Still, I kept climbing. By then, I'd become known for reforms and training. I saw soldiers breaking under the wrong pressures, injuries that could have been prevented, mental stress left to fester until it claimed lives. So I rewrote protocols, pushed through new resilience programs, demanded better safety measures. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't earn me headlines, but it saved lives. And slowly, respect followed. Not the forced kind that comes with rank, but the genuine kind, the kind you can see in the eyes of the men and women you lead. I built something my father could never tear down. Still at night, the silence weighed heavy. There were moments after long missions when I'd step into my quarters, peel off my uniform, and sit in the dark with nothing but the hum of the air unit. My chest ached, not from wounds, but from absence. From the empty chair at every ceremony, from the father who couldn't or wouldn't see me. It would have been easy to let bitterness consume me, but bitterness doesn't build. It only corrodes. So instead, I chose resolve. I turned every disappointment into fuel, every slight into motivation. Each scar, each loss, each silence became another brick in the fortress I was building inside myself. By the time I pinned on the eagle of a full colonel, I no longer reached for the phone when something big happened. I no longer waited for approval that would never come. I had stopped chasing. And in stopping, I had finally found peace. By the time I reached the rank of Brigadier General, I thought nothing my father did could surprise me anymore. Silence had become the steady background noise of my life, like static on a radio I'd long since tuned out. But hope is a stubborn thing. When the official orders came through promoting me to general, I sent him a letter, handwritten, deliberate, each word chosen, like a soldier picking his steps through a minefield. Dad, I know you don't agree with my path, but I want you to know I took your lessons. All of them. Discipline, honor, responsibility. I've carried those into every command, into every battle, into every life I was entrusted with. And today, I was promoted to Brigadier General. I hope, even if you can't say it, that somewhere inside you, you know I've done right by the uniform. Your daughter. I sealed the envelope and sent it off without expectation. But expectation is a tricky beast. It hides in the corners of your chest, even when you tell yourself you've let it go. 2 weeks later, I heard from one of his old army friends, a man who still called me kiddo when I ran into him at military events. He told me Dad had read my letter 3 times, then tore it in half. I thanked him, nodded politely, and walked away with my jaw tight. Later that night, in the silence of my office, I let the anger come. Not the wild, explosive anger I'd felt when he first kicked me out, but the cold, heavy kind that sinks into your bones. That was the moment I stopped writing. If he wanted silence, then silence he would have. Around that time, Matthew announced his engagement. He called me personally. "I want you there," he said, voice careful, like he was testing fragile glass. I hesitated. Does Dad know? He does, Matthew admitted. He's not thrilled. But this isn't about him. It's my wedding. You're my sister. Please come. 17 years had passed since the night my father told me to get out. 17 years of distance measured not in miles, but in missed birthdays, empty chairs, funerals, and ceremonies where one half of my family pretended I didn't exist. But this was my brother, the kid who'd once slipped me notes of encouragement when I was alone at the academy. The boy who'd watched me leave with a duffel bag and eyes full of apology. I said yes. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, memories clawed their way back. Him slamming the door, the manila folder of college applications he tried to force on me, the empty rows at every milestone of my career, the email after Mom's funeral as cold and formal as a government memo. I trained myself to be ready, to endure his presence the way I'd endured desert heat and mortar fire. I told myself he can't touch you anymore. Not your rank, not your worth, not the soldiers who would follow you into hell without hesitation. And yet, when the day came, my stomach still nodded as I slipped into my dress uniform. The medals glinted against my chest, weighty reminders of the lives I'd lived and the ones I'd saved. I stared at myself in the mirror, 4 stars gleaming on my shoulder, and whispered, "This is who you are, not his daughter, not his disappointment. A general." The wedding was beautiful. White roses, a soft string quartet, the air thick with celebration. Matthew looked nervous, but happy as he stood at the altar waiting for his bride. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. My father, older now. His hair grayer, his frame a little smaller, but his posture just as rigid. Arms crossed, jaw set the same scowl carved into his face. For a moment, the years fell away, and I was that teenage girl again, standing in the living room with an acceptance letter clutched in my hand, begging him to see me. Then he turned his voice low enough that only I could hear. If it wasn't for pity, he sneered, "No one would have invited you?" The words slid under my skin like glass. 17 years, and nothing had changed. I lifted my wine glass, took a slow sip, and smiled. Because this time I knew something he didn't. This time I wasn't walking into exile. I was walking into reckoning. The reception hall buzzed with laughter silverware clinking against china champagne flutes raised high in toasts. I sat quietly at my table, posture straight, uniform crisp. The 4 stars on my shoulder caught the light, though most of the guests didn't know what they meant. I felt my father's eyes on me like crosshairs. Even after all these years, he still carried himself as if every room were his to command. But the truth, he had no command here. Not anymore. I sipped my wine slowly, the tartness grounding me. I didn't need to respond to his sneer, not with words. Life had already answered him. Then the music softened. The bride, radiant in lace and pearls, walked to the center of the dance floor, a microphone trembling slightly in her hand. She cleared her throat, smiled nervously, and said, "Before we continue tonight, I'd like to take a moment." The room hushed. "I know weddings are about families coming together," she began. And tonight, I want to acknowledge someone whose sacrifice and service have shaped not just this family, but this nation. She turned toward me, her eyes locked with mine full of respect. "Please rise," she said, her voice steady now, "and join me in honoring Major General Davis." For a heartbeat, the room froze, forks halfway to mouths, glasses suspended mid-air. Then chairs scraped back one by one. People stood. Applause swelled hesitant at first, then rolling like thunder. I stayed seated, letting it wash over me. The faces in that hall blurred, but I could see one clearly, my father's. His mouth was tight, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. He didn't move, didn't stand. His pride chained him to his chair, even as everyone else in the room rose to their feet. Matthew's eyes flicked between us, torn. The bride smiled through tears, microphone still in hand, and repeated to Major General Davis. The applause grew louder. A standing ovation in the middle of a wedding. For me. I finally rose, then slow and deliberate, glass still in hand. My heels clicked against the floor, each step echoing in the silence between the claps. I didn't bow. I didn't wave. I simply inclined my head, a soldier's nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, voice clear but calm. The ovation went on longer than I expected. Long enough that I saw people glancing toward my father, waiting for him to rise. He never did. And that was when it hit me. Revenge didn't come in the form of anger or shouting or demanding his respect. Revenge came in the form of silence breaking in a way he couldn't control. Revenge came when an entire room stood for me while he sat alone. Blood didn't stand, but honor did. Afterward, people approached me, guests I'd never met shaking my hand, thanking me for my service. Some shared stories of fathers, brothers, daughters who'd served. Others simply said they were proud. I smiled politely, responded with gratitude. All the while, I felt the empty gravity of his silence behind me. At one point, I turned half expecting him to leave, but he stayed rigid, refusing to look my way. It didn't matter anymore. The recognition I had chased my entire life wasn't his to give. It was already mine. As the night wore on, laughter returned to the hall, music swelled, couples danced. I sat for a moment watching, feeling a strange mix of peace and ache. Matthew came over, tugged at his tie. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "I am." He hesitated, then said, "You deserved that. Every bit of it." For the first time that night, I let myself breathe. Because he was right. The wedding ended, the way weddings always do, music fading into laughter, champagne, dwindling guests filing out into the night with shoes in their hands and ties loosened. I stayed until the end, shaking hands, hugging my brother, watching the joy on his face as he and his bride left under an arch of sparklers. My father left quietly. No goodbye, no acknowledgement, just a rigid back slipping into the shadows of the parking lot. I thought it would sting more than it did, but the truth, I felt lighter. Because I finally understood his silence was his burden, not mine. For years, I had carried the weight of his rejection like a rucksack too heavy to shrug off. I thought, if I just achieved enough, climbed high enough, earned enough medals, he would finally see me. But in that hall, with strangers standing and applauding, while he sat stone still, I realized something. I didn't need him to see me. The world already did. Weeks later, a letter arrived at my office. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. "I didn't stand because I didn't know how. I don't understand what you've become, but I know it's more than I ever gave you credit for. If you'll allow it, I'd like to talk. Not as soldiers, not as ranks, just as father and daughter." I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just set it down and sat in silence. That night, I told my husband about it. Yes, by then, I was married too. He asked gently, "Do you want to see him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't owe him anything." "No," he said, "but maybe you owe yourself the choice." A month later, I met him at Arlington. Not at a banquet hall, not at a wedding, but at my mother's grave. He wore civilian clothes, He looked smaller, older. No medals, no pins, no armor. Just a man who had outlived too much of himself. We talked quietly. Not about wars, not about medals, about regrets, about silence, about how absence becomes its own kind of cruelty. And when we parted, he did something I'll never forget. He straightened slowly and raised his hand to his brow in a salute. Not sharp, not perfect, but earnest. I returned it not because he had earned forgiveness, but because he had finally chosen truth. The years that followed brought new commands, new responsibilities. But I carried that moment with me, not as vindication, but as proof that even the hardest walls can crack. One day, a young lieutenant asked me what the most important lesson of my career had been. I told her this. Respect isn't inherited. It isn't given by blood. It's earned by showing up, by standing up, and by never letting silence define you. And now, as I sit here telling you this story, I want to leave you with a question. Who stood for you when no one else did? When did you rise above what was meant to break you? If you've carried silence, rejection, or doubt, I hope you find the moment when the world finally stands for you. Because it will. And when it does, you'll know as I did that some salutes come from blood, but the ones that matter come from those who choose to stand. And those are the salutes that last forever. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect, maybe share your own story below or subscribe for more. We rise together.